St Osyth is a small village on the east coast of England. It's hard to imagine that behind these houses in 1921, an accidental discovery of two skeletons reignited the story of one of the all too common travesties of justice in the 16th and 17th centuries, a real witch hunt. In the late 16th century, the population of St Osyth was no more than a few hundred people. The priory was already a private residence. The people lived off the land and sea, the nearby creek providing a much valued source of free protein in the form of fish and eels. In 1582, St Osyth became a national news story, a sensational trial of not one, but 14 alleged witches. Now, to put this in perspective, in an average year in Essex, you would probably hear of perhaps 4 witch trials, each dealing with normally 1 or maybe 2 people. And if you were one of those unlucky enough to be accused, there was a high chance that you would be acquitted.
Most communities more than tolerated people who claimed to have unusual powers. It was a normal way of life and part of English folklore to have someone, usually a woman, who could heal or to whom you could unload your troubles and feel better afterwards. Some had a great knowledge of herbs and basic medicine. If some people thought that their recovery was due to some supernatural power as well, then that only helped the reputation of the healer. Ursula Kemp fell into this category. Infuriatingly, we don't know her age. We do know that at the time of her trial she had an 8-year-old son, Thomas, and that she had had at least 2 relationships.
It wasn't a good idea to be on your own in the 16th century. If your husband died, you found another quickly. Ursula had a small income from helping people who were poorly. She also attended childbirths and expected to be paid for that as well.
Ursula frequently had disputes with a neighbour, Grace Thurlow. Despite this, Ursula attended when Grace's son, Davy, was ill, strangely taken and greatly tormented, as it was described, probably a fever of some kind. Ursula walked in and out of the door 3 times, saying, "Poor child, how thou art loaden," and pronounced that the child would recover. He did, and Ursula's reputation was confirmed. Ursula fully expected to be given the job of attending Grace for the forthcoming birth of her daughter, but was highly miffed when the job was given to someone else.
Even after all this, Ursula tended Grace when she fell lame and charged her 12 pence for curing the lameness. When Grace said that she couldn't pay, either in cash or in cheese, Ursula flew into a rage and Grace's lameness returned. The bad feeling continued between the two, and when Grace's baby daughter, now aged 3 months, fell out of its cot, broke its neck and died, Ursula was blamed for causing this, even though she was nowhere near at the time. This was the cue for Grace to pour out all her rage and frustrations to the local magistrate, Brian Darcy.
Ursula was arrested. She was questioned on at least 3 occasions by Darcy over the space of 5 days. His house, where the interrogations are believed to have taken place, still stands today. The local lockup, where she was initially kept, although much changed, is also still there. Darcy interrogated Ursula's son, Thomas, making him give evidence against his own mother. This wasn't a particularly uncommon practice. Thomas said that his mother kept 4 spirits or familiars, and that they were called Tiffin, Piggin, Titty and Jack.
Darcy also made two brothers, aged 6 and 9, give evidence against their mother in the same witch hunt. Darcy promised Ursula that if she did tell him the truth, then she would be treated with compassion. Darcy didn't regard this as being inappropriate at all, and Ursula took him at his word, confessing and naming several of her friends. She was promptly committed to trial on 3 charges of murder by witchcraft and held in custody in the cells of Colchester Castle to await her fate at the county assizes. We get most of our information on the events from a pamphlet published very soon after the trial. It was almost certainly prepared by Darcy himself, and 2 copies are known to survive. Fortunately, several people have now transcribed it into a more readable form.
We do have to be a bit careful with the contents though. Some evidence is clearly missing and some of the dating is suspect. But it does give us a fantastic insight into the tragic events and the mindsets of so long ago. The Chelmsford Shire Hall of that time where the assizes were held is long gone. It stood further forward than the present building. Ursula was tried along with Elizabeth Bennet, Alice Newman and 11 others. These 3 were found guilty of murder by witchcraft. It's always been assumed that they were executed shortly after the trial, but that wasn't the case.
Remarkably, some original trial documents, all in Latin, have survived. This is an indictment which jointly charges Ursula Kemp and Alice Newman with the murder of Stratton's child, and this one accuses Elizabeth Bennet of the murder of William Byatt and his wife. Jail calendars in the National Archive show that all the accused, with one exception, were brought back to Colchester Castle after the trial. Maybe they appealed against their sentences. To this day, their ordeal is commemorated, and every year flowers are placed at the castle gates on the anniversary of the trial. It's fair to say that it's the pagan community that's done more than any other group in keeping this story alive. They're also very keen for the remains to be reburied. But the remains might not be Ursula Kemp. In 1921, a Mr. Brooker was digging in his back garden in St Osyth when he uncovered a skeleton. It was nowhere near the churchyard and also couldn't be associated with the priory. It was buried in a north-south orientation rather than the normal Christian east-west style. It was immediately proclaimed to be Ursula Kemp, and the local newspaper ran several stories also confirming that the skeleton was nailed into the ground or bound with chains. One story refuted this but was largely ignored.
When a second damaged skeleton was uncovered on the same site a few months later, this was naturally said to be that of Elizabeth Bennet. Now Mr. Brooker made some money out of this. He put a hatch over the grave of the first skeleton and charged people 6 a time for a view of the bones. Now this grisly tourist attraction carried on for over 10 years until the house burned down and the remains were again covered over. Hundreds of miles away, here in Boscastle, Cornwall, a most extraordinary man got to hear about it. Cecil Williamson ran the Witchcraft Museum, and he had a most unusual background. He'd been interested in witches and witchcraft as a boy, and in the Second World War he'd even worked for the Special Operations Executive. He was an expert on English folklore and customs. Today, the museum is owned and run by Graham King.
Good old Cecil, my predecessor here, set this up a long while ago just to tell people about folk magic, which was once a very important part of English life. So he started the museum after the war. Really interesting character, had a fascination with witchcraft right back to his school days. And he travelled throughout the world and found that wherever he went, the same systems of magic were used.
So, has Graham noticed a revival of interest in the old religion?
Oh, there's no question there's a revival of interest now. It has been this last, sort of 100 years, I suppose, certainly the last 50 or so. And in some areas, like down here in Cornwall, it never really died away. And I think maybe just the way things are progressing, people just want to get back to grassroots and some, the good old-fashioned remedies and spells and charms.
Whilst it might seem a bit odd to us now, the presence of a wise woman in a village or community in the late 16th century was actually seen as quite a bonus.
Oh, absolutely. The cunning woman, the wise woman, that would be, in a village like this or in any village in the country, you didn't have doctors around, or certainly not very often. If you had something wrong with you, you'd go and see the wise woman. And these are the women that have been tagged with the name witch, which has got the obvious evil associations. But quite often they were the healers, the helpers, yeah.
Having done the deal to acquire the skeleton, Cecil was actually a bit slow in following it up, to the extent that it needed a G-up letter from St Osyth to spur him into action.
So we've certainly got in our files a letter from the owner of the house saying, come and get this skeleton, you bought it. And I suspect Cecil read about the find in the papers and thought, well, what's going to happen to those skeletons?
Beverly Aldridge remembers being taken to see the remains when she was a very small child.
It was only next door to where we are now, and my grandparents lived here, and I can remember my nan saying, I didn't understand, I remember saying that it was a witch, and I was frightened because as a child you imagine a witch like you see it in fairy story books, don't you? I didn't even think about it, I didn't even know, I don't suppose I knew what a skeleton was, but I can remember thinking I was going to see somebody, like in a black cloak and a broomstick and all of that. But when it was a bit of a letdown really, when I actually went and looked in the hole and it was just like a pile of bones. I didn't even really realise what I was looking at, I don't think. But I can remember the drama, because there was people in the road coming to have a look, and the fact that a television came, because not everybody had a television then, did they? So
it's quite an event with quite a few people there then?
Oh yeah, from what I can remember. I mean, I wouldn't say hundreds, but certainly the local people in the road had appeared, yeah. I'm sure the feet were laying towards the road. That's how I can remember it. They knew they'd got a woman's skeleton.
And so it was in late 1963 that Cecil went to St Osyth to exhume the remains and bring them back here to Boscastle.
But why this skeleton?
Because there's a number of factors which point to it being that of a witch, and every indication that it should be that of Ursula Kemp, a very famous witch of St Osyth who was hanged in 1582 at Colchester.
Yes. Now, why is she here? I mean, why bury her in a plot like this?
That would be very hard to answer, but the principle was that she was accused by the church, tried by the lay people and executed for her conniving with the devil, and quite naturally they said that she was pagan and unchristian and that they wouldn't have her anywhere near the churchyard, so they had to put her somewhere, and probably her people had some influence, possibly paid somebody, bribed somebody, I should imagine, and they buried her quietly at the back of their premises.
Now, you're going to move her today, sir, probably for the last time. Is this going to bring a curse on the village?
Well, I think I can say with a certain amount of confidence, no. The reason for that, and you may smile, but having dealt with witches and witchcraft for so many years, I treat it with very great respect, and I can assure you that I have taken every precaution to see that as far as occult and magic goes, that there'll be no disturbance.
Do you mean you've cast a counter spell in some way?
Oh, you could put it as simply as that.
Having skeletons in a museum, obviously that's something that's at the moment is controversial. We had another skeleton here when we took it over, and we've since buried her. But I know Cecil looked at these skeletons as being guardians of the museum and used to talk to them and such like. He would have treated her affectionately. The way with all of the exhibits here, he was a kind man, and I think he treated these things kindly. He certainly believed in an afterlife, and he believed that things retained spirit. So he would have treated them as if he would have treated a living person, I suspect. Yeah.
For all Cecil's interest in Ursula and her history, he was actually a bit careless about labelling. This is the label that he placed in the coffin with the remains. There's several errors in it. The date's wrong for a start, and also there is no record of her trial at Lambeth Palace because she wasn't tried in a church court. Her remains were on display here at Boscastle for over 30 years. As he approached his own end in 1999, Cecil gave some thought as to what to do with Ursula, and he told at least 2 people that Ursula was safely bricked up. But in a letter to a friend, he suggests something quite different. He suggests that in fact he is considering passing her on. Robert Lenkiewicz is the next character to appear in this story, and it's fair to describe him as eccentric. He was a prolific artist who lived here in Plymouth and had amassed a huge library of rare and old books, many of them on the subject of witchcraft and witch persecution. He knew Cecil Williamson and had painted his portrait. Anna Navas was Robert's long-term friend.
I mean, it does frustrate me when people say, oh, he was obsessed with death and he was obsessed with women, or, you know, they decide because they've read some tabloid journalism that he was obsessed with something. And, you know, I think it would be fair to say that Robert was obsessed with human behaviour. You know, and death is an aspect of that, of, you know, human experience, that I think he found anything that concentrated people's ideas. He was interested in why it is that people choose one particular belief system over another, why people are willing to die for an idea, or, you know, or be killed, or to kill for an idea. And that's what really motivated him, trying to understand where that came from.
So why on earth would Robert Lenkiewicz want to have the skeleton of a reputed witch? Was it purely academic? Or did he want it for some darker purpose?
He thought this would be a fantastic artefact to add to that collection. He didn't have any particular emotional, you know, idea about it. It was just about having an artefact that was going to illustrate perfectly one part of his library. And he was pleased to have her, very pleased to have her. And again, you know, Robert, you know, like I say, you know, there were no organs playing in the background and creaky doors, although the library door to the witchcraft room was quite creaky, but that was accidental, I believe. You know, he wasn't going to do anything spectacularly terrible. He was just going to have her in that part of the library.
It's not totally clear how the negotiation was done, but in 1999, Robert Lenkiewicz bought the skeleton and it transferred here to Plymouth.
And I think the body, or the bones, they make you think about, you know, the power of ideas and how they can make people behave in the strangest of ways. And that's what interested Robert more than anything at all, really. It wasn't about, oh, look at this witch. It was simply about, you know, this is an artefact that illustrates a really interesting point about human behaviour and human belief systems and what we're capable of believing, and the way those beliefs can shape our actions. And I think, you know, having something like that for Robert was just a really good shorthand way of illustrating that point.
Robert had a history of heart problems and very wisely took steps to ensure that his estate would be properly dealt with when he died. He died, in fact, in 2002, aged just 60. It's proved to be a 9-year job for his executor, Peter Walmsley, to administer his estate.
I knew the job would be enormous, and I had talked to him because I knew he had a serious heart condition and he'd had a triple bypass operation about 10 years before he died. He knew that he had to prepare to some extent for what happened after his death, and I had discussed that with him, and he had promised to let me have a map of Plymouth indicating where his various studios and collections of paintings were held, so that, you know, we could get access to them and also to let me have duplicate sets of keys for all those premises so that we would keep them here in the office, and if anything happened to him, at least we could get access to the buildings and know where the collections were. Because he was a very secretive man, and no one knew the full story. You know, each person who knew him had a little bit of the story, but nobody knew the full story, and I was aware of that, and I thought, well, you know, if anything happens to him, we're going to have a tremendous job finding collections of art, and of course there was a huge risk that a lot of it would disappear because it was very valuable. Well, typical to Robert, we never got the map, all the sets of keys. I mean, I was amazed to find that he had paid minimal income tax, even though obviously he earned a lot of money from the sale of his paintings. He didn't seem to pay any council tax or business rates for all the premises that he used. And there are lots and lots of bills like that, electricity bills and so on, which, you know, perhaps you and I would, you know, if we didn't pay, we'd be in the county court and have judgments against us and bailiffs coming in knocking on our doors. But somehow Robert seemed to have sidestepped all that and managed to go through life without, you know, paying those sort of bills. So there was a huge number of claims against the estate, over 200 claims, before we could start to think about you know, dealing with the provisions of his will.
Well, the biggest problems are the mundane problems of a complicated life. Robert, you know, there were lots of people who were owed paintings that were half finished, and you know, what do? Do you give them a half finished painting, or do you give them what they paid for the painting, or do you give them what the painting would be worth? You know, these are legal wranglings that I think, you know, nobody really wants to have to deal with.
It was agreed that we would sell part of the library collection to raise money, which could then be used to pay creditors, on the basis then that if there were sufficient assets in the estate, the Linkovich Foundation Trust would effectively receive paintings in lieu of the proceeds of the sale of the library, and thereby would be able to preserve a major part of the collection of paintings.
And the foundation did have to had an input into the decision-making process for that, because there were paintings, there were core paintings that the foundation absolutely wanted to have saved if it was at all possible.
In the event, a number of sales took place and raised several £1 million.
Left now, £8,000 a month, 8,500 big, 9,000, no thank you, £8,500 I'll sell near me here, at 8,500, thank you. At 4,200.
Both the executor and the Linkovich Foundation agreed that it wouldn't be appropriate to sell the remains believed to be Ursula Kemp, and so the skeleton has had to stay with the rest of the property until the estate can be finalised. While the estate is being wound up, all the property is in a state of limbo, and that includes Ursula. Ursula seems to attract people of a caring disposition like Cecil and Robert. While safeguarding some of the artefacts in the estate, Sheila Walmsley has ensured that the remains have been kept with some dignity. And like Cecil, she has the occasional conversation with Ursula.
Over the years I've become quite fond of her, and when I've spent many hours here on my own, I've got nobody else to talk to. So we've got quite a good relationship going.
Sheila even mentioned to Ursula that this film was being made.
I did ask her when we were here alone again one day that if she felt uneasy or uncomfortable about being filmed, she would have to give me a sign. And within a couple of hours, I'd driven back from Plymouth to Torquay, where I live, and the alarms had been set off. And that's usually the indication that she's not happy about something.
Things have tipped over, windows have closed themselves, which had been rusted open, and so you couldn't shut, and then one day you'd go back and the window had shut itself, even though it would have been against the force of gravity, and odd things like that. But there may be other explanations for those things, but it does seem strange that it's all happened in the one building and not in all the other buildings as well, which Robert had control of.
So can this skeleton, or the 400-year-old spirit of Ursula Kemp, really be having a physical effect today? Who knows? In all the time that the remains have been above ground, They've never been properly examined, and over the last 90 years the bones have been rearranged several times, often in completely the wrong order. And while at Boscastle, a third thigh bone has somehow been added, as well as numerous pieces of animal bone. It's going to take an expert to sort out this 3D puzzle.
Archaeology is predominantly and first and foremost about people. And I never lose track of the fact that I am dealing with the remains of somebody who was alive at some point. And I take that responsibility very seriously because I think it is a serious thing to do. It's the closest you can get to somebody who was here before us. As you can see, we've got most of one skeleton here. Some of the hand bones are missing, one of the leg bones is missing, and some of the foot bones are missing. But by and large, we have one entire skeleton. Now, the next question is, does this match with the bones that were found in the 1920s? And I think the answer is yes, they do. If we look at the material we've got here, it matches quite nicely with what we've got on this photograph from the 1920s, from 1921 this is. The things that stand out, if I turn it that way round, I know it's upside down, but it matches what I've got on the table. You can see there's quite a lot of curvature in these tibia, the shin bones. They're really quite curved on here, and it matches what we've got on here. But the other thing that also matches is the bones that are present, the bones that are missing, and at least some of the fractures that we've got. We can see that we have both of the arm bones are there, but we've got a fracture on this bone that matches one on here. Now it looks a bit different on here because I've laid it out with the palms up, which means that the radius lies on the outside, whereas here it's palms down, so it's crossed over. But that bone does match the broken one on here. So I think we can be quite happy that what we've got on here matches the skeleton that we've got here. But there are quite a few fractures that we have on this skeleton that do not show on this photograph. However, if we go to the photograph that was taken in 1963, the second time this was opened, we start to find some more matches. And this is really rather strange because there's quite a lot of fracturing around almost the knee area of the big thigh bones on both sides. These bones were not broken in the original photograph. They're only broken on the second photograph, which is a little bit strange. Also, somebody has been moving bones about because one of these bits of bone has been shuffled up on this photograph from 1963. So there are some odd things which really need some explaining. Differences between what we see from 1921 and 1963. Before I go on to look in that a little bit more detail, I just want to talk about staining, because we have staining to the bone, two lots of staining to the bone, one of which I think is original, and the other one which may hold a key to what was happening and causing this fragmentation in 1963. Up the top here, if we look at this bone here, this is the manubrium, the top of the sternum. It's this little bit that's here on the chest. There's some green staining right at the very top of it. That green staining is matched by staining to the two lowermost of the cervical or neck vertebra, which again are in this area here, and also to the third of the right ribs here. Now all those stains would be from a copper alloy item that would have sat more or less where this necklace of mine is sitting now. But no bronze is recorded as having been found, either in 1921 or in 1963. So whatever that has come from has been removed and taken away from the grave before we recorded it. The other place we have staining is on the legs. On the original photograph, there is no sign whatsoever of any iron on this part of the bone. There's no staining, there's no iron. When we get to 1963, that iron is there, and oddly enough it corresponds, certainly on one side, with where there are breaks to the bone, which is a little bit strange. Now, I looked, this bone here was quite badly fractured, and I managed to put most of it together. But if we turn this over and look at this backside here, so that's the back of the leg, that piece of bone actually does fit in there. It fits into that position. But I can't get it in place because that rusting will not allow me to get it in. Now that suggests that that breakage had occurred before that rusted to it. Now we know it wasn't broken and the iron wasn't there in 1921, and it is there in 1963, which suggests the iron got into the grave and broke the bone in the intervening years.
So what does this mean? Quite simply, it means that in 1921, when the skeleton was first uncovered, someone robbed the grave of a bronze medallion or charm, and Mr. Brooker, or someone acting for him, deliberately drove iron spikes through the bones simply to enhance the witch story. In St Osyth, many residents are convinced that she was nailed down, and this is why. When they or their parents saw the skeleton in the grave, it was nailed down. The trouble is, this happened in the 20th century and not the 16th.
We need to ask ourselves how old we think the skeleton is. When does it date to? Well, one of the things that gives me a guide to that is, say, looking at the pathology we see on this individual, particularly the teeth, because before the introduction of sugar in the 18th century, when it would have become readily available to most people, although people's teeth might get quite worn, they might get dental disease of various types, they didn't have the high incidence of dental caries, tooth decay, that we might expect them to, because that really happened when people started eating too much sugar. And if we look at the teeth of this individual, there's absolutely no sign whatsoever of any carious decay in there. Now that suggests to me that we have got somebody who predates the 18th century. But looking at the teeth, there are two things that strike you. One is that it can give us some indication of the actual age of the individual at time of death, and also it tells me there is not a lot of pathology, and generally there isn't a lot of pathology on this skeleton. The teeth are really relatively lightly worn, which suggests we haven't got somebody who's very old, but there are other parts of the skeleton that give me a better indication of age. If we look, say, for instance, at the top end of the femur, you can see this line around the head of the femur here. Now that's where the fusion of the epiphyses, the growing end of the bone, has taken place. The fact that you can still see the line indicates that we've got somebody who is not that far beyond the age of fusion. If we look at part of the pelvic bone, you can see the same thing. This is this bit of the hip, the bit that sort of sticks out at the side. We're looking at the iliac crest. And again, you can see there's a line going round there where the crest has fused. Now that suggests somebody who's maybe in their early 20s. But the really useful bone is the collarbone. Now this is the part that comes in like that. So we're looking at the medial or the inner part of the collarbone, and that has not ossified yet at all. So I think this individual was in their early 20s. And that's quite nice to be able to give such a close age range. I mentioned briefly pathology. There is very little pathology on this individual, but one thing we do have, which suggests they had a fairly strenuous lifestyle, is something called Schmoll's nodes. Now these develop in the vertebra. I'm trying to find a good example. There's two good examples there actually. This is where somebody has basically really badly strained their back, and the intervertebral disc has perforated slightly, and the fluid within it has leaked out and created these depressions or little holes in the vertebral bodies. And that tends to be, again, something that happens with somebody who's quite young. But this individual was also quite a strong and robust individual. You can see there's quite big muscle attachments on the arms and the legs. I mean, that's that arm there. I mean, this is where the big upper arm muscle attachments are, and that is really quite a strong bone. In fact, altogether, this individual is really quite large and robust. And that, I think, brings us on to the sex of the individual. I don't think this is Ursula Kemp, because I think this was a man. The size and robusticity of the bone is one of those indications, but of course you can get tall females the same way as you can get tall males, and we've estimated the stature of this individual at about 5'8", which is slightly above average for males of the time, but would have been quite a lot above the average for females, which would be more in the range of about 5'4". But if we look at the pelvis, which is the classic place that you look to assist with indicating the sex of individuals, if I put these bones together, so that's what the pelvic girdle would have looked like. The two areas to look at are where my fingers are at the moment. My fingers are sticking through, and that's the greater sciatic notch. And the part of the pelvis, this is where you need the arms of Shiva, and I haven't got them, but the bit at the front, right at the front in here. Now looking there, those angles are all quite acute, and that is an indication of a male pelvis. So all in all, we appear to have a young adult male in his early 20s, and certainly we don't appear to have Ursula Kemp.
So what do we have? The radiocarbon dating puts this chap squarely in the right time frame. He was living in the village at the same time as Ursula Kemp and may well have known her. We know that at the time of his death, he was in his early 20s and he'd had a hard, strenuous life. We also know that in 1966, 3 further skeletons were uncovered on the same site.
Yeah, I remember the one when they come to dig the foundations out, and some Irishmen turned up, and when I come home from work that night, there was bones and some skulls laid on our coal bunker next door, and we think one of the skulls had a flint spearhead or something stuck in it. But I think at that time the Irish labourers had gone. The tools were left up against, stood up against the coal bunker, and they'd gone. There was never more to return.
Although they were examined by the local pathologist at the time, those findings have now been lost. So why were they all buried outside the protection of the church? Now, this was a big thing. In the late 16th century, people had a horror of being buried anywhere other than in a churchyard. Now, murderers, heretics, tramps, and yes, people executed as witches would have been casually thrown into a pit. The other possibility is that he came from a family group or community who had suffered the tragedy of an infectious disease, and it was thought appropriate to bury them all quickly. What's often overlooked in this story is the turmoil and upheaval that this must have caused in the community. 18 people, including several children, died in a fairly short time period, giving rise to these witchcraft accusations. Whole families must have been torn apart by their different allegiances. And what happened after the trial? What happened to Thomas, Ursula's son? And what happened to those that were acquitted of the charges against them? How did they fit back into their society? These are questions that the bald documents of the time will never give us the answers to. So if we don't have Ursula Kemp, where is she? You may remember that I said after the trial, all the accused with one exception were brought back to Colchester Castle. The one name missing from the list is Ursula Kemp. She was held to be the ringleader, and it's most likely that she was publicly hanged within a day of her trial here in Chelmsford and simply thrown in a pit. A dreadful end for a much wronged woman. After the examination of the skeleton, there was a further 6 months of further negotiation with the Lenkovich Foundation and with the coroner. Finally, after nearly 4 years of work, I was able to return the skeleton to St Osyth. The council even found a plot in unconsecrated land in a north-south orientation to match the original burial. Well, welcome to what I think is the happiest funeral I've ever attended. We're here to respect and honour this resident of St Osyth, who was shamefully removed from the grave and whose remains were desecrated and used as a curiosity over the last 90 years. We know that this is not Ursula Kemp. We represent different beliefs, but we're united in our joy of being able to finally return this poor soul to rest. The precise identity of this person is unknown and will probably never know your full history. We're here to do the right thing by you, but it is impossible to conduct this ceremony without reflecting on the tragic events of 1582 and remembering Elizabeth Bennet, Alice Newman, Alice Hunt, Cicely Sellis, Henry Sellis, Alice Manfield, Margaret Greville, Marjorie Salmon, Elizabeth Eustace, Annis Hurd, Joan Peachy, Annis Glassock, Joan Robinson, and of course Ursula Kemp. We hope with all our hearts that this will be your final resting place. As we lower you into the ground from which you were taken, we wish you nothing but peace and love. There will be a permanent memorial to you and all that you represent. We will keep your history alive. And now, I'm sure that we all have our own thoughts about this day and who we honour. Let's just spend a few moments in quiet reflection. It would be good to think that in these enlightened times that such atrocities no longer take place. And certainly the evidence in these old cases would be seen today for the tripe that it is. Witch hunts do still happen, not just in Africa or India, where hundreds still die each year, but also here in England. Some aspects of the tabloid press vilify the innocent. Vulnerable or mentally ill people are bullied to the extent that they commit suicide. People are attacked for their colour or religious beliefs. Intolerance, ignorance and prejudice are still very much with us. Here, when we buried the remains, there are representatives of the Christian faith, pagan and also non-believers. The parish council refused to let the pagan representatives speak. We'll probably never know who this poor soul is. We know that it's not Ursula Kemp, who of course was dreadfully treated in life. And this guy was dreadfully treated in death. But he has kept the story of Ursula Kemp and all her co-defendants alive. And without his discovery in 1921, we certainly wouldn't be talking about it now. So, whoever you are, rest in peace. Since making this documentary, I've been able to make good on my promise to have a permanent memorial to those accused of witchcraft. I approached Colchester Town Council and I'm pleased to say that they were very supportive of the idea, and after some discussion and getting scheduled monuments approval, an ideal spot was chosen directly in front of Colchester Castle, where so many of the accused were held before their trial. In April 2018, After fundraising in the local community, a small ceremony was held to unveil the plaque. We now have a permanent spot to place our flowers and remember significant dates in this shameful part of our history. In the hope of an end to persecution and intolerance. Cheers.